The assignment. Nobody wanted Marcus Rodriguez had been a documentary filmmaker for 15 years, but he had never received an assignment quite like this one. The network executives sat across from him in their pristine conference room, their faces serious as they explained what they wanted. A documentary about urban wildlife in Detroit's abandoned districts. It sounded simple enough, but Marcus knew better than to trust simple assignments from network television. "We want you to focus on how nature reclaims urban spaces," the lead executive explained, sliding a thick folder across the polished table. "There have been reports of deer, wild birds, even coyotes moving into the empty neighborhoods. It's a story about hope and renewal." Marcus flipped through the paperwork, noting the generous budget and the unusually long timeline. 6 months to complete what should have been a 3-month project. Something felt off, but the money was too good to refuse. His small production company needed this contract to stay afloat. His cameraman, Jake Peterson, was less enthusiastic when Marcus called him later that evening. Jake had worked the rough neighborhoods before, and he knew the real dangers had nothing to do with wild animals. The abandoned sections of Detroit were home to more than just urban wildlife. Drug dealers, squatters, and worse things moved through those empty streets after dark. "You sure about this one, Marcus?" Jake asked over the phone. "I've got a bad feeling about filming in those areas. The cops don't even patrol some of those blocks anymore." But Marcus had already signed the contracts. Their small crew would consist of just 3 people, Marcus directing, Jake on camera, and Sarah Chen handling sound equipment. Sarah was young but talented, fresh out of film school with technical skills that impressed even veteran operators. She had volunteered for the project when she heard about the urban exploration angle. The trio met at Marcus's office the following Monday to plan their approach. The office was cramped, filled with editing equipment and stacks of old footage from previous projects. Marcus spread out city maps across his desk, marking the locations the network had specifically requested they film. "These neighborhoods have been empty for years," Marcus explained, pointing to several circled areas. "The city basically gave up on them after the economic crash. Perfect places for wildlife to move in." Sarah studied the maps carefully, her finger tracing the street layouts. "Some of these areas don't even have working streetlights anymore. We'll need to bring our own power sources for any evening shoots." Jake nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I've been reading news reports about these districts. There have been some strange incidents lately. People hearing gunshots, but when police investigate, they find nothing. No shell casings, no evidence of violence. Probably just kids with firecrackers," Marcus dismissed. "Or maybe hunters going after those urban deer you mentioned." But Jake wasn't convinced. He had covered enough crime stories to recognize the signs of something more serious. "There was one report that caught my attention. A security guard at a warehouse on the edge of one of these districts claimed he saw someone on a rooftop with what looked like a rifle. When police checked it out, the roof was empty." Sarah looked up from her equipment checklist. "Maybe it was just someone with a camera telephoto lens. From a distance, those long lenses can look like rifle barrels." Marcus wanted to believe that explanation, but Jake's concerns were starting to make him nervous. He had learned to trust his cameraman's instincts over the years. Jake had a talent for sensing danger that had kept them both safe during previous projects in unstable situations. "Let's just stick to daylight filming for the first few weeks," Marcus decided. "We can assess the situation as we go and decide about any night shoots later." They spent the rest of the day going through their equipment inventory. Their gear was professional but not top of the line. The camera was a reliable model they had used for years, though it had been showing signs of age lately. Occasionally, the LCD screen would flicker, or the autofocus would hunt more than it should. Jake had been asking for budget approval to replace it, but the company finances were too tight. "This camera has seen better days," Jake muttered, checking the lens mounts for the 3rd time. "I just hope it holds together long enough to finish this project." Sarah was more optimistic about their equipment situation. Her sound gear was newer, and she had brought several backup microphones and recording devices. "Even if the camera acts up, we can still capture good audio. Sometimes the sound tells the story better than the pictures anyway." The following week, they made their first trip to the filming locations. Driving through the abandoned neighborhoods was more unsettling than any of them had expected. Entire city blocks stood empty, with broken windows staring out like dead eyes. Weeds grew through cracks in the sidewalks, and abandoned cars sat rusting in driveways. But there were indeed signs of wildlife. They spotted several deer grazing in what had once been front yards, completely unafraid of human presence. Birds nested in the eaves of empty houses, and Jake managed to capture footage of a red fox trotting down the middle of a street in broad daylight. "This is actually pretty amazing," Sarah admitted, recording ambient sound of birds singing in the urban wilderness. "It's like nature is taking back the city." Marcus felt his initial skepticism fading as they gathered compelling footage throughout their first day. Maybe this assignment would be straightforward after all. The network executives might have been genuine about wanting a nature documentary. As afternoon turned to evening, they decided to pack up their equipment and return the next day. But as Jake was storing the camera in its protective case, he noticed something troubling. The LCD screen had developed a new problem. Instead of just flickering, it was now displaying strange interference patterns that he had never seen before. "That's weird," he said, showing the screen to Marcus and Sarah. "It looks almost like electronic interference, but there's nothing around here that should cause that." Sarah looked at the patterns on the screen with professional interest. "I've seen similar interference when there are strong radio signals nearby. Sometimes military or police communications can cause problems with consumer electronics. But there's no military base around here," Marcus pointed out, "and the police said they don't patrol these areas regularly." Jake powered down the camera and the interference disappeared. When he turned it back on, the screen seemed normal again. Maybe it was just a fluke. Old equipment can be unpredictable. As they drove away from the filming location, none of them noticed the figure watching them from a rooftop 3 blocks away. The figure held professional-grade binoculars and had been observing their activities throughout the afternoon. When their van disappeared around the corner, the figure made a brief phone call, spoke only a few words, then melted back into the shadows of the abandoned building. The hunt was about to begin, and Marcus Rodriguez's documentary crew had unknowingly become part of a much larger and more dangerous story than they could have imagined. The first signs of trouble. The second week of filming started with unusual optimism. Marcus and his crew had settled into a routine, arriving at different abandoned neighborhoods each morning and capturing footage of the remarkable wildlife that had claimed these urban spaces. Their initial concerns about safety seemed overblown as they encountered nothing more threatening than curious deer and the occasional stray dog. Jake's camera had been performing better since their first day, with only minor glitches that seemed typical for aging equipment. He had learned to work around the occasional LCD flicker, and had even captured some stunning shots of a hawk family nesting in the broken window of a former office building. Sarah had become fascinated with the acoustic properties of the empty neighborhoods. The lack of traffic and human activity created an almost rural soundscape in the middle of the city. She spent hours recording the subtle audio environment, from wind moving through broken structures to the calls of birds that had never been heard in these areas before the economic collapse. "Listen to this," Sarah said during their lunch break, playing back audio through her professional headphones for Marcus and Jake to hear. You can actually hear individual bird songs that would be completely masked by city noise in active neighborhoods. Marcus was pleased with the footage they were gathering, but he had started noticing some inconsistencies in the locations the network had specified. Several of the addresses on their shooting list led to buildings that were still partially occupied or showed recent signs of human activity. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, cigarette butts that hadn't been weathered by months of exposure, and even the occasional piece of newer litter suggested that these abandoned areas weren't as empty as they appeared. "Someone's been through here recently," Jake observed, pointing his camera at fresh footprints in the mud near what was supposed to be a completely vacant warehouse district. "These prints are maybe a day or two old." Sarah nodded, adjusting her microphone boom to avoid picking up the sound of their conversation. "I've been noticing things too. Yesterday I recorded what sounded like a vehicle engine in the distance, but when we looked around, there was nothing on any of the streets we could see." Marcus tried to maintain his focus on the wildlife documentary, but the signs of recent human presence were becoming harder to ignore. More troubling was the feeling that they were being observed. It was nothing concrete, just an uncomfortable sensation that had grown stronger each day. On Thursday morning of their second week, they decided to explore a particularly promising location that the network had marked as high priority. It was a former residential area where entire blocks of houses stood empty, their yards returning to prairie grass and wildflowers. The rehabilitation of urban spaces by nature was exactly the kind of footage the network claimed to want. Jake was setting up for a wide shot of deer grazing in front of an abandoned elementary school when his camera malfunctioned in a way none of them had seen before. Instead of the usual LCD flicker, the screen went completely black for several seconds, then displayed what looked like a thermal imaging view of their surroundings. "What the hell is that?" Marcus asked, staring at the strange green and yellow patterns on the camera's screen. "I have no idea," Jake replied, checking all the camera settings. "I didn't change anything. This mode shouldn't even exist on this model." Sarah looked over their shoulders at the display. "It looks like infrared or thermal imaging, but consumer cameras don't have that capability. Are you sure you didn't accidentally switch to some kind of night vision mode?" Jake cycled through every menu option on the camera, but couldn't find any setting that would produce the thermal-like image they were seeing. More disturbing was what the image appeared to show. While their normal vision revealed empty streets and buildings, the thermal display showed several bright spots that seemed to indicate heat sources inside structures that were supposed to be vacant. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing at the screen. "That building on the corner. The thermal view shows something warm on the third floor, but we can see through the windows that it's completely empty." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Maybe it's just a malfunction. Old equipment can produce weird glitches. But as they watched, one of the heat signatures on the screen seemed to move from one window to another on the same floor. The movement was too deliberate and purposeful to be a technical error. Jake quickly switched the camera off and back on, hoping to clear whatever malfunction was causing the thermal display. When the camera powered up again, it seemed to function normally, showing their surroundings in regular color. But the brief glimpse of hidden activity had shaken all three of them. "We should probably report this to the police," Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Marcus shook his head. "Report what? That our camera malfunctioned and showed us something that looked like thermal imaging? They'd think we were crazy." "But if there are people in these buildings when they're supposed to be empty," Jake argued, "maybe we're filming in areas where we shouldn't be. Maybe that's why we keep feeling like we're being watched." They decided to continue filming, but with much more awareness of their surroundings. Marcus found himself constantly scanning rooftops and windows, looking for any sign of the heat signatures they had glimpsed on the camera display. The wildlife footage they captured that day was technically good, but the relaxed atmosphere of their previous filming sessions was gone. Late in the afternoon, they were packing up their equipment when Sarah's audio monitoring equipment picked up something unusual. Through her professional headphones, she heard what sounded like radio chatter, faint but clearly human voices using some kind of communication system. "Wait," she said, holding up her hand for silence. "I'm getting radio transmissions." Marcus and Jake stopped moving and listened. But without Sarah's sensitive audio equipment, they couldn't hear anything beyond the usual sounds of wind and distant traffic from active parts of the city. Sarah adjusted her equipment, trying to isolate and amplify the signal. "It's definitely radio communication, but it's scrambled or in some kind of code. The signal strength suggests it's coming from pretty close by." "Maybe it's police or emergency services," Marcus suggested hopefully. "No," Sarah said, continuing to monitor the transmissions. "Police and fire department radios have a different quality, and they don't usually use scrambled signals. This sounds more like military communication." The three of them looked around nervously at the empty buildings surrounding them. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows between the abandoned structures, creating dozens of places where someone could observe them without being seen. "I think we should call it a day," Jake said, his voice tight with anxiety. As they loaded their equipment into the van, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the dust on their vehicle's windshield, someone had drawn a simple symbol while they were working. It looked like a crosshair sight, the kind used on rifle scopes. "Did either of you draw this?" Marcus asked, pointing at the symbol. Jake and Sarah both shook their heads, staring at the marking with growing alarm. "Someone was close enough to touch our van," Sarah whispered. "Close enough to watch us the entire time we were here." They drove away quickly, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their departure was being observed and reported to someone. The wildlife documentary assignment was beginning to feel like a cover story for something much more dangerous. That evening, Marcus called the network executive who had hired them, hoping to get more information about the locations they had been assigned to film. But the executive was evasive, claiming that the specific addresses had been chosen by a research team that was no longer available for consultation. "Just stick to the shooting schedule," the executive said before ending the call abruptly. "And remember, this project has a generous completion bonus if you finish on time and without complications." The bonus was significant enough to make Marcus hesitate about backing out of the assignment, but Jake and Sarah were becoming increasingly concerned about their safety. None of them realized that their accidental discovery of the thermal imaging capability had revealed the first evidence of a network of hidden watchers who had been using the abandoned neighborhoods for purposes that had nothing to do with urban wildlife. The camera reveals more than it should. The crosshair symbol on their windshield haunted Marcus throughout the weekend. He spent Saturday researching the neighborhoods they had been filming, looking for any information that might explain the strange occurrences they had witnessed. What he found made him more concerned about their assignment. Several of the locations on their shooting list had been mentioned in police reports over the past 6 months. Not for violent crimes or drug activity, but for reports of suspicious activity that investigating officers could never substantiate. Residents from adjacent neighborhoods had reported hearing unusual sounds, seeing unexplained lights in supposedly empty buildings, and noticing vehicles in areas where no legitimate business should bring anyone. Most troubling were 3 separate reports of people claiming to have seen individuals with rifles on rooftops, but in each case, police searches found no evidence of weapons or even recent human presence. The reports were dismissed as misidentifications or pranks, but the pattern was clear to Marcus. Someone was using these abandoned areas for activities they didn't want discovered. Monday morning brought a phone call that increased Marcus's anxiety about the project. The caller identified himself as Detective Ray Morrison from the Detroit Police Department's Special Investigations Unit. "Mr. Rodriguez, I understand you've been filming in some of the abandoned districts for a documentary project," Detective Morrison said. "I'd like to meet with you and your crew to discuss some safety concerns." Marcus agreed to meet the detective at a coffee shop near his office, bringing Jake and Sarah along for the conversation. Detective Morrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much over a long career. He got straight to the point. "The areas you've been filming in aren't as empty as they appear," he began. "We've had reports of organized activity in those neighborhoods, but every time we investigate, we find nothing. It's like whoever is operating there has advance warning of our investigations." "What kind of organized activity?" Sarah asked. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Morrison replied. "The reports are inconsistent. Sometimes it's vehicles moving through the area at night. Sometimes it's people on rooftops with what might be weapons. Sometimes it's radio transmissions that don't match any legitimate emergency services or commercial operations." Jake leaned forward. "We've noticed some strange things too. Our camera malfunctioned and showed what looked like thermal imaging of people in buildings that appeared empty." Morrison's expression became more serious. "What kind of camera are you using? Standard documentary equipment doesn't have thermal capability." "That's what we thought," Marcus explained. "But somehow our camera displayed what looked like heat signatures in buildings that seemed vacant." "I'd like to see that footage," Morrison said. "And I need to warn you about something. 3 weeks ago, we found evidence that someone has been using these abandoned areas for sniper training, long-range shooting practice, probably using empty buildings as both firing positions and target areas." The coffee shop suddenly felt very quiet as Morrison's words sank in. Sarah was the first to speak. "Sniper training? You mean someone has been practicing shooting from those rooftops while we've been walking around down below?" "That's our concern," Morrison confirmed. "We found spent shell casings hidden in a building that would give a clear sight line to several of the locations on your filming schedule." Marcus felt sick. "Why didn't anyone warn us about this before we started filming?" "Because we didn't have confirmation until last week," Morrison said. "And because officially, this investigation doesn't exist. We're looking into this on our own time because the regular chain of command seems uninterested in pursuing it." Jake pulled out his camera and showed Morrison the most recent examples of the electronic interference they had been experiencing. "Could sniper training explain this kind of equipment malfunction?" Morrison studied the camera's display with interest. Possibly. If they're using electronic surveillance equipment to monitor their training areas, it could interfere with your recording devices. Some of the newer surveillance systems operate on frequencies that can disrupt consumer electronics. But who would be conducting sniper training in abandoned neighborhoods? Sarah asked. Military? Police special units? That's what we're trying to find out, Morrison said grimly. But whoever it is, they have resources and organization that suggest this isn't amateur activity. Morrison gave them his contact information and made them promise to call immediately if they encountered anything suspicious during future filming. He also suggested they consider suspending the project until the investigation was resolved, but Marcus explained that backing out of the contract would financially devastate his small company. Then be extremely careful, Morrison warned. And, if your camera equipment starts showing those thermal images again, don't ignore them. That malfunction might be saving your lives by showing you where hidden observers are positioned. After Morrison left, the three filmmakers sat in uncomfortable silence, processing what they had learned. Their documentary about urban wildlife had somehow intersected with what appeared to be an illegal training operation for snipers. We could just film in different locations, Sarah suggested. There are plenty of abandoned areas in the city that aren't on our original list. But the network specifically requested these locations, Marcus pointed out. If we change the shooting sites, they might cancel our contract. Jake was examining his camera again, looking for any clues about its mysterious thermal imaging capability. You know what's really bothering me? How did our camera develop a function that shouldn't exist? Consumer cameras don't just spontaneously gain thermal imaging abilities. Maybe someone modified it, Sarah suggested. Is it possible that someone accessed our equipment and installed additional hardware? Marcus felt a chill as he considered that possibility. Their equipment was usually stored in his office, but several people had keys, including a cleaning crew that worked in the building at night. If someone wanted to modify their camera for surveillance purposes, they would have had opportunity. We need to have the camera examined by a technician, Marcus decided. If someone has tampered with our equipment, we need to know about it. The next morning, they took the camera to a repair shop that specialized in professional video equipment. The technician, an older man named Frank, who had worked with broadcast equipment for decades, spent an hour examining the camera inside and out. This is very interesting, Frank said finally. Someone has definitely modified this camera. There's additional circuitry that doesn't belong, and it's connected to the main processing unit in a way that would allow it to override normal display functions. What kind of additional circuitry? Jake asked. It looks like a receiver for external imaging data, Frank explained. Someone could transmit thermal or infrared imaging signals to this camera from a remote location. Essentially, they've turned your camera into a display monitor for surveillance equipment. Marcus stared at the camera in shock. So when we saw those thermal images, we weren't seeing a malfunction. We were seeing surveillance footage that someone was broadcasting to our camera. That would be my assessment, Frank confirmed. The question is whether this modification was done to help you or to monitor you. As they left the repair shop, Marcus realized that their documentary project had become something much more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. Someone had given them the ability to see hidden surveillance, but whether that someone was trying to help them avoid danger or draw them deeper into it remained unclear. The Elusive sniper training operation was using their documentary crew as unwitting participants in a much larger game, and Marcus was beginning to suspect that their assignment had never been about wildlife at all. The equipment breaks down at the worst possible time. Armed with the knowledge that their camera had been deliberately modified, Marcus and his crew approached their next filming session with a mixture of determination and fear. They had decided to continue the project, but now they understood that their equipment was providing them with surveillance intelligence that could keep them alive. Frank, the repair technician, had offered to remove the unauthorized modifications, but Marcus made the decision to leave them in place. If someone was trying to help them see hidden dangers, they needed that advantage more than ever. The thermal overlay seems to activate automatically when the camera detects certain electronic signatures, Jake explained as they prepared for their Wednesday morning shoot. It's like someone programmed it to warn us when we're being watched through surveillance equipment. Sarah had been doing her own research into surveillance technology and had made a disturbing discovery. The type of modification in our camera requires sophisticated knowledge of electronics and access to military-grade components. This isn't something a hobbyist could do in their garage. So we're dealing with professionals, Marcus concluded. The question is whether they're on our side or just using us for some purpose we don't understand yet, Detective Morrison had called the night before with additional information that made their situation even more complex. The police investigation had discovered evidence of at least 3 different groups operating in the abandoned neighborhoods, possibly competing with each other for control of the territory. We think there might be a turf war developing, Morrison had explained. Someone is trying to establish training facilities in these abandoned areas, but they're facing opposition from other groups who have their own interests in keeping the neighborhoods empty. Marcus had asked the obvious question. What happens to civilians who accidentally get caught in the middle of this conflict? Morrison's pause before answering had been answer enough. On Wednesday morning, they chose to film at a location that had shown particularly strong wildlife activity during their previous visits. It was a former shopping center where deer had taken up residence in the abandoned parking lot, and several species of birds nested in the broken storefront signs. Jake set up the camera for a long shot of the deer, but as soon as he powered on the equipment, the thermal overlay activated immediately. The display showed multiple heat signatures in buildings surrounding the parking lot, more than they had ever seen before. There are people everywhere, Sarah whispered, looking at the thermal display. At least a dozen different positions in the buildings around us. Marcus counted the heat signatures, noting that they were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across the entire parking lot. This looks like some kind of military operation. We're in the middle of a training exercise, or an ambush, Jake added grimly. They were debating whether to retreat immediately when Sarah's audio equipment picked up radio transmissions much stronger and clearer than anything they had heard before. Through her headphones, she could make out actual words despite the electronic scrambling. I'm hearing countdown numbers, she reported. Someone is coordinating something and it sounds like it's about to happen. That's when Jake's camera chose the worst possible moment to experience a complete system failure. The LCD screen went dark. The autofocus motor began making grinding noises and the thermal overlay disappeared entirely. They were left blind in the middle of what appeared to be an active combat training scenario. The camera's dead, Jake announced, frantically trying different power combinations. Complete electrical failure. Marcus felt panic rising as he realized they had lost their only means of seeing the hidden watchers around them. The thermal overlay had become their lifeline, and now they were trapped in an exposed position without any way to know where the danger was coming from. We need to get out of here right now, Sarah said, pulling off her headphones. The radio chatter is getting more intense. Something big is about to happen. But as they began gathering their equipment, they heard the sound that confirmed their worst fears. The sharp crack of a high-powered rifle echoed across the empty parking lot, followed immediately by the sound of breaking glass from one of the surrounding buildings. Sniper fire, Jake said, dropping low behind their equipment cases. They're actually shooting. More rifle shots followed, but not aimed at them. The shots seemed to be directed at targets in the buildings around the parking lot, as if 2 different groups were engaging each other in a firefight. Marcus realized they were caught in the crossfire of exactly the kind of conflict Detective Morrison had warned them about. Stay low and move toward the van, Marcus ordered. But as they began crawling across the asphalt, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. Wait, she called out, still monitoring her audio equipment despite the danger. I'm picking up someone calling for help. Someone's been hit. Through the chaos of radio transmissions and gunfire, Sarah had isolated a signal that was different from the military-style communications they had been hearing. This was someone using a civilian emergency frequency, calling for medical assistance in plain English. There's a civilian casualty in one of these buildings, Sarah reported. Someone who isn't part of whatever operation is going on here. Marcus faced an impossible decision. They could flee to safety and leave an injured person to die, or they could risk their lives trying to help someone who might be an innocent victim of the training exercise gone wrong. The decision was made for them when Jake's camera suddenly flickered back to life. The thermal display reactivated, showing them not only the positions of the armed figures around the parking lot, but also a single heat signature in a ground floor storefront that appeared to be motionless and growing dimmer. There, Jake pointed at the screen. That heat signature is fading. If that's the person calling for help, they're losing body heat fast. Sarah continued monitoring the emergency transmission. They're saying they're trapped under debris in the old electronics store. They can't move. More gunfire erupted around them, but Marcus noticed that the shooting seemed to be directed away from the storefront, where the injured person was trapped. It was as if both sides in the conflict were deliberately avoiding that area. I think they're trying to create a safe corridor, Marcus realized. The thermal overlay is showing us a path to the injured person that avoids the active firing positions. Jake studied the camera display more carefully. You're right. Look at this pattern. The heat signatures are positioned to create a clear lane from our position to that storefront. Sarah looked up from her audio equipment with amazement. The emergency transmission isn't random. Someone is guiding us. They're telling us exactly where to go and when to move. As if to confirm her observation, her radio picked up a new transmission on a different frequency. This time the voice was clear and unscrambled, speaking directly to them. Documentary crew in the parking lot. This is your guardian angel. Follow the thermal path on your camera display. You have a 3-minute window before the next phase of the exercise begins. Move now. Marcus stared at the camera display, realizing that their modified equipment wasn't just showing them surveillance footage. It was providing real-time tactical guidance from someone who was coordinating their movements through the dangerous situation. The elusive sniper they had been unknowingly documenting wasn't hunting them. He was protecting them, using their own equipment to guide them safely through a conflict that threatened to expose secrets much larger than a simple wildlife documentary. But as they prepared to follow the thermal path toward the injured civilian, Marcus wondered what price they would ultimately pay for becoming pawns in a game they still didn't understand. The sniper steps out of the shadows, following the thermal path displayed on their modified camera. Marcus and his crew moved carefully across the abandoned parking lot toward the electronics store, where someone was trapped and calling for help. The gunfire around them had stopped, creating an eerie silence that was somehow more frightening than the sounds of combat. Jake kept the camera trained on the thermal display, calling out directions as the heat signatures of hidden watchers shifted positions around them. It was clear that their movement was being coordinated by someone with a complete overview of the tactical situation. Guardian Angel, this is the documentary crew, Sarah spoke into her audio equipment, hoping their mysterious protector could hear them. We're halfway to the target location. What's our status? The response came immediately through her headphones. You're doing fine. Maintain current direction. Be advised. The injured party is a federal agent who was conducting surveillance when the training exercise went active. This situation is more complex than you realize. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications sank in. They weren't just caught in the middle of illegal sniper training. They had stumbled into what appeared to be a conflict between federal law enforcement and whoever was running the training operation. Federal agent? Marcus whispered to Sarah. What kind of surveillance operation? Before Sarah could respond, they reached the broken storefront where the injured person was trapped. Through the shattered windows, they could see a woman in civilian clothes pinned under a collapsed display rack. She was conscious but clearly in pain, with what appeared to be a leg injury that was bleeding significantly. Are you the documentary crew? The woman asked weakly as they climbed through the window opening. Agent Lisa Park, FBI. I've been monitoring your activities for the past 2 weeks. Jake looked up from trying to lift the debris off her leg. Monitoring us? Why? Because your documentary assignment was a cover story, Agent Park explained, wincing as they shifted the weight off her injured limb. The network executives who hired you are connected to the group running illegal training operations in these neighborhoods. They wanted civilian witnesses to provide cover for their activities. Sarah began applying pressure to Park's leg wound using supplies from their first aid kit. So our wildlife documentary was fake from the beginning? Not fake, Park corrected. But it was designed to provide a legitimate reason for people to be in these areas while more serious activities were taking place. Your presence gives them plausible deniability if anyone asks questions about increased activity in abandoned districts. Marcus felt anger building as he realized how thoroughly they had been manipulated. What kind of training operations? What are they preparing for? Agent Park's expression grew more serious. We believe they're training civilian contractors for overseas private military work. Basically creating mercenaries for hire in conflicts where the government can't officially send military personnel. And the sniper who's been helping us? Jake asked, still monitoring the thermal display on his camera. Is he part of your operation or theirs? That's complicated, Park admitted. The person you call your guardian angel is Staff Sergeant David Chen, former Army sniper who was discharged under controversial circumstances 3 years ago. We thought he was working with the illegal training operation, but his actions today suggest he might be a double agent. Sarah looked up from treating Park's wound. Chen, that's my last name too. Is he related to me? Your older brother, Park confirmed. He's been using the modified surveillance equipment to monitor your safety since you started filming here. When he learned that his sister was being used as unwitting cover for illegal activities, he decided to switch sides. The revelation that Sarah's own brother had been secretly protecting them throughout their filming assignment explained many of the mysteries they had encountered. The camera modifications, the surveillance warnings, and the tactical guidance were all part of David Chen's efforts to keep his sister safe while gathering evidence against the training operation. So David has been the one sending us the thermal imaging? Sarah asked, her voice tight with emotion. Among other things, Park confirmed. He's been documenting the entire training operation from inside, waiting for the right moment to expose it. Your documentary crew provided the perfect cover for an FBI investigation. Before anyone could respond, Sarah's radio equipment crackled with an urgent transmission from David Chen himself. Sarah, this is your brother David. I know this is a shock, but I need you to listen carefully. The training operation is about to go active with live ammunition. They've discovered Agent Park's surveillance and they're planning to eliminate all witnesses. Sarah stared at the radio in disbelief. She hadn't spoken to her brother in over 2 years. Not since their family had fractured over his military discharge and the circumstances that led to it. Hearing his voice now in the middle of this dangerous situation brought back a flood of emotions she had tried to suppress. David, where are you? She asked into the microphone, her voice shaking. Rooftop position about 200 meters northeast of your location. I've been watching over you since you started this assignment. I couldn't let them use you as expendable cover for their operation. Marcus helped Agent Park sit up against the wall, while Jake continued monitoring their surroundings through the thermal camera display. David, this is Marcus Rodriguez, the documentary director. What exactly is this training operation preparing people for? Assassination contracts, David's voice came back grimly. They're training civilian shooters to eliminate specific targets in foreign countries. Political figures, business leaders, activists, anyone who threatens certain corporate interests. The abandoned neighborhoods provide perfect urban combat training scenarios. Agent Park nodded weakly. We've been tracking this organization for 8 months. They recruit former military snipers who have grudges against the system, promising them large payments for overseas contract work. But you didn't take their offer, Sarah said to her brother through the radio. I pretended to, David replied. I wanted to gather enough evidence to shut them down completely. But when I learned they were using my sister as cover, the mission became personal. Jake looked up from the camera display with alarm. The thermal signatures are moving. It looks like they're repositioning for some kind of coordinated attack. David, we need an extraction plan, Marcus said into the radio. Agent Park is injured and can't move quickly. Already working on it, David responded. I've been coordinating with FBI backup teams, but they're still 20 minutes out. I need to buy you time by disrupting their operation. Through the broken windows of the electronics store, they could see movement in several of the surrounding buildings. The organized nature of the positioning suggested that the training operation had shifted from practice exercises to a real combat situation. Sarah, I need you to understand something. David's voice continued through the radio. The people running this operation aren't just training mercenaries. They're planning to use those mercenaries to destabilize governments in countries where American corporations want to extract resources without interference. Agent Park struggled to stand, supported by Marcus and Jake. Your brother has been gathering evidence of connections between this training operation and several major corporations that have been lobbying for military intervention in resource-rich regions. So this is about more than just illegal weapons training, Sarah realized. It's about creating private armies for corporate interests. Exactly, David confirmed. And they're willing to kill anyone who threatens to expose the operation. That includes FBI agents, documentary crews, and even former military personnel who know too much. The sound of vehicles approaching from multiple directions interrupted their conversation. Through the broken storefront, they could see armed figures moving between buildings with the precision of a well-trained military unit. "David, they're closing in on our position," Jake reported, watching the thermal display as heat signatures converged on their location. "I can see them," David replied. "Sarah, I need you to trust me completely for the next few minutes. I'm going to create a diversion that will draw their attention away from your building, but you'll need to move fast when I give the signal." "What kind of diversion?" Marcus asked, dreading the answer. "The kind that reveals my position and makes me a target," David said simply. "I'm going to start taking out their spotters and communications equipment. Once they realize there's a sniper working against them, they'll focus on hunting me instead of you." Sarah felt tears forming as she understood what her brother was planning. "David, that's suicide. They'll have overwhelming numbers." "Maybe," David acknowledged, "but I've been preparing for this possibility for months. I know every sight line, every escape route, every weakness in their tactical positioning. And I have something they don't expect." "What's that?" Agent Park asked. "A little sister who's been documenting their entire operation without knowing it," David replied. "Sarah, your sound equipment has been recording all their radio communications for weeks. That evidence, combined with the video footage Jake has been capturing, will be enough to bring down the entire network." Jake looked at his camera with new understanding. "So our equipment malfunctions weren't malfunctions at all. You've been using our documentary equipment to gather intelligence. Every thermal image, every radio intercept, every piece of surveillance footage has been automatically transmitted to secure FBI servers," David confirmed. "Even if something happens to us today, the evidence will survive." The sound of footsteps on broken glass outside the storefront indicated that their hiding place had been discovered. Through the thermal display, they could see armed figures positioning themselves for an assault on the building. "Time's up," David announced. "Sarah, I want you to know that everything I've done has been to protect you and to honor the oath I took to defend this country. Even when the country didn't want to defend me." "David, wait," Sarah began, but her brother had already initiated his diversion. The sharp crack of a high-powered rifle echoed across the abandoned shopping center, followed immediately by the sound of someone shouting orders in panic. David Chen had announced his presence to the illegal training operation, and the hunt for the elusive sniper who had been documenting their activities was about to begin. But Sarah and her documentary crew now understood that they weren't just witnesses to this conflict. They were the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached far beyond abandoned neighborhoods in Detroit, threatening to destabilize governments around the world for corporate profit. The hunt becomes a war. David Chen's rifle shots created immediate chaos among the training operation personnel. Through their thermal camera display, Marcus and his crew could see the organized tactical positions dissolving as armed figures scrambled to locate the source of the sniper fire that was systematically destroying their communication, equipment, and surveillance devices. "He's taking out their electronic infrastructure," Agent Park observed, listening to the panicked radio chatter through Sarah's audio equipment. "Without their coordination systems, they're just individual shooters with no tactical advantage." Sarah watched the thermal display with growing anxiety as her brother's heat signature moved rapidly between different positions on the rooftops. "He's changing locations after every shot. That's what they taught him in the army. It's also what's keeping him alive," Jake added, tracking the movements of the hunters trying to triangulate David's position. "They can't pin him down long enough to mount an effective counterattack." Marcus helped Agent Park toward the back exit of the electronics store, following the thermal path that David had programmed into their camera. The route led through a series of connected buildings that would provide cover while moving toward the extraction point, where FBI backup teams were approaching. "Sarah, status report." David's voice crackled through the radio between rifle shots. "We're moving Agent Park toward the northeast exit route," Sarah replied. "How long can you maintain the diversion?" "As long as necessary," David answered, but his breathing was becoming labored. "I've eliminated 6 of their spotters and 3 communication arrays. They're operating blind now, but they're also getting desperate." The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions as the training operation personnel abandoned precision shooting in favor of suppressing fire designed to pin down their elusive target. The abandoned shopping center became a war zone as hundreds of rounds were fired at rooftop positions where David might be hiding. "They're using military-grade assault weapons," Agent Park noted grimly. This isn't training equipment anymore. They've escalated to full combat protocols. Jake's thermal camera showed the devastating effectiveness of David's tactics. Despite being outnumbered at least 10 to 1, the former Army sniper had disrupted their entire operation by eliminating key personnel and equipment. The remaining members of the training operation were firing blindly at shadows while David picked his targets with surgical precision. There's something else, Sarah said, monitoring multiple radio frequencies. I'm picking up transmissions that suggest this training operation has connections to operations in other cities. Detroit isn't the only location where they're running illegal mercenary training. Agent Park nodded weakly as they helped her through a connecting doorway between abandoned stores. We suspected as much. The FBI has been tracking similar activities in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore, all cities with large abandoned districts that provide urban combat training environments. So this is a nationwide operation, Marcus realized. They're creating a network of private military, contractors using abandoned American cities as training grounds, and they're funded by corporations that want to use those contractors to destabilize foreign governments, Agent Park confirmed. The evidence your brother has been gathering could expose the entire network. Through the broken windows of their current hiding place, they could see vehicles arriving with additional personnel to reinforce the training operation. The situation was escalating beyond what David could handle alone, even with his superior tactical skills and knowledge of the terrain. David, they're bringing in reinforcements, Sarah reported into the radio. Multiple vehicles with what looks like a full tactical team. I can see them, David replied, his voice tight with concentration. Professional contractors, not trainees. They brought in the real mercenaries to hunt me down. Jake monitored the thermal display as new heat signatures deployed with military precision around the shopping center. These aren't amateurs. They're moving with coordinated patterns that suggest special forces training. Your brother just went from hunting trainees to being hunted by professionals, Agent Park observed. The odds just shifted dramatically against him. Sarah felt her heart racing as she watched the thermal signatures of the professional hunters closing in on the areas where David had been operating. Her brother had sacrificed his concealment to protect them, and now he was facing opponents who matched his skill level but had overwhelming numerical superiority. Sarah, I need you to do something for me. David's voice came through the radio with new urgency. There's a laptop hidden in the building where you filmed the deer on your first day. It contains all the evidence I've been gathering for months. If something happens to me, make sure Agent Park gets that laptop. Nothing's going to happen to you, Sarah said firmly, though her voice betrayed her fear. Listen to me, David insisted. The laptop has financial records, communication intercepts, and video evidence that connects this training operation to 12 major corporations and 3 government officials. It's enough to bring down the entire network, but only if it reaches the right people. The sound of explosions echoed across the shopping center as the professional mercenaries began using grenades to clear buildings where they suspected David might be hiding. The abandoned structures, already weakened by years of neglect, began collapsing under the assault. They're trying to bring down the buildings, Marcus observed with horror. They're willing to destroy the entire area to eliminate one target. Agent Park struggled to stand straighter, adrenaline overriding her pain. That's because David represents an existential threat to their operation. He knows too much, and he has the evidence to prove it. Through Sarah's audio equipment, they could hear the professional mercenaries coordinating their assault with military precision. These weren't the barely trained civilian contractors they had been observing for weeks. These were experienced combat veterans who had been brought in specifically to eliminate David Chen. Sarah, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. David's voice came through the radio with surprising calmness despite the chaos around him. You became the documentary filmmaker I always knew you could be, and your work here is going to save lives by exposing what these people are really doing. David, don't talk like that, Sarah pleaded. FBI backup is almost here. You just need to hold out a little longer. Maybe, David replied, but I need you to understand something. When I was discharged from the Army, it wasn't because I did something wrong. It was because I refused to participate in operations that involved civilian casualties. The same kind of operations these mercenaries are being trained to carry out. Jake looked up from the thermal display with sudden realization. That's why they recruited him. They thought a soldier who had been kicked out of the military would be motivated by revenge against the system. But they misjudged him, Agent Park said with admiration. Instead of seeking revenge, he chose to expose their activities and protect his sister. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that FBI reinforcements were finally approaching the area. But as Sarah watched the thermal display, she could see that the professional mercenaries were moving with increased urgency to complete their mission before law enforcement arrived. "David, FBI backup is almost here," Sarah transmitted. "Can you hold your position?" "Negative," David replied, and they could hear gunfire very close to his radio position. "They've found my primary hide site. I'm moving to secondary position, but they're anticipating my routes now." The thermal camera showed David's heat signature moving rapidly across rooftops while multiple pursuers converged on his location from different directions. The hunt for the elusive sniper had become a desperate race against time, with the evidence of a nationwide conspiracy hanging in the balance. Sarah realized that her brother's survival and the exposure of the entire mercenary training network now depended on whether he could evade professional killers long enough for the FBI to secure the area and retrieve the laptop containing months of carefully gathered intelligence. The truth finally comes to light. FBI tactical teams arrived with the precision of a military operation, surrounding the abandoned shopping center and establishing a perimeter that trapped the mercenary trainers inside their own training ground. Through Sarah's audio equipment, they could hear the sudden shift in radio communications as the professional hunters realized they were now surrounded by federal agents. "This is FBI Special Agent Morrison," came the familiar voice of the detective who had warned them about the sniper training. "All personnel in the abandoned shopping district are ordered to lay down weapons and surrender immediately." Sarah looked at Marcus with surprise. "Morrison? The detective who met with us at the coffee shop?" Agent Park managed a weak smile despite her injuries. "Ray Morrison has been coordinating the FBI investigation from the beginning. His meeting with you wasn't coincidental. We needed to assess how much you knew about what you had been filming." Jake monitored the thermal display as the professional mercenaries found themselves caught between David Chen's sniper position and the advancing FBI teams. "The heat signatures are scattering. They're trying to escape through the abandoned buildings. They won't get far," Agent Park assured him. "We've been mapping their escape routes for months. David provided intelligence about every exit and hiding place in this area. Through the chaos of the tactical operation, David's voice came through the radio with evident relief. "Sarah, I'm secure. The professionals are neutralized or in custody. FBI teams are moving to secure the evidence." Sarah felt tears of relief as she heard her brother's voice. "Are you injured? You sound exhausted." "Just tired," David replied. "I've been living on adrenaline and caffeine for 3 months, waiting for the right moment to bring this operation down. Having you here provided the perfect cover for gathering the final evidence we needed." Marcus helped Agent Park toward the FBI medical team that was approaching their position. "So our documentary assignment was legitimate after all? We really were filming urban wildlife?" "The wildlife footage was real," Agent Park confirmed. "But the network executives who hired you were connected to the training operation. They wanted civilian activity in the area to provide cover for their more sensitive activities." Jake was reviewing the footage they had captured over the past 3 weeks, realizing how much evidence they had unknowingly gathered. "We have hours of video showing vehicles, personnel movements, and equipment that we thought were just background elements in our nature documentary. All of that footage has been automatically transmitted to FBI servers," David's voice explained through the radio. "The modifications to your camera weren't just for thermal imaging. They created a complete surveillance record of the entire operation." As FBI agents secured the area and began processing evidence, Sarah finally had the opportunity to see her brother face to face for the first time in 2 years. David Chen emerged from his rooftop position looking older and more weathered than she remembered, carrying the professional sniper rifle that had made him so effective against overwhelming odds. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you what was really happening," David said as they embraced carefully, mindful of his equipment and her emotional state. "But if you had known you were gathering intelligence instead of filming wildlife, your reactions wouldn't have been natural. The authenticity of your documentary work was crucial for maintaining cover." Marcus watched the reunion between the siblings while processing the magnitude of what they had uncovered. How extensive is this mercenary training network? How many other cities are involved? Agent Morrison approached their group, no longer disguised as a local detective, but clearly in command of the FBI operation. Based on the evidence David gathered and the files we've seized today, we believe the network operates in at least 8 major cities with abandoned urban areas suitable for combat training. And the corporate connections? Sarah asked, still holding onto her brother's arm as if afraid he might disappear again. 12 major corporations with overseas resource extraction interests, Morrison confirmed. They were funding the training operation to create private, military contractors who could destabilize governments without direct U.S. military involvement. Jake had been examining his camera equipment with new understanding of its capabilities. All those equipment malfunctions we experienced, the thermal imaging, the radio interference, the electronic glitches, those were actually surveillance systems working exactly as designed. Your brother spent weeks modifying your equipment to create a mobile intelligence gathering platform, Morrison explained. Every piece of footage, every audio recording, every electronic signature was being collected and analyzed to build our case against the training operation. Agent Park, now receiving medical treatment from FBI paramedics, called out to the group. The laptop David mentioned, we need to retrieve it immediately. That contains the financial records that will allow us to trace the money flow back to the corporate sponsors. David nodded toward the building where they had filmed deer on their first day of the assignment. It's hidden in the basement storage room behind a false wall I constructed. Everything you need to prosecute the entire network is on that device. As FBI teams moved to secure the laptop and other evidence, Marcus realized that their failed wildlife documentary had become something much more significant. What happens to our footage now? We still have a contract with the network. Morrison's expression grew serious. The network executives who hired you are currently being arrested on conspiracy charges. Your contract was part of an elaborate money laundering operation designed to fund illegal mercenary training. So our documentary company was unknowingly being used to launder money for corporate-sponsored terrorism, Sarah said, the full implications finally sinking in. Essentially, yes, Morrison confirmed, but your cooperation with our investigation and the evidence you gathered will be crucial for prosecuting everyone involved in the conspiracy. Jake looked at his modified camera equipment with a mixture of admiration and concern. Will we be able to keep any of this footage for a real documentary? This story needs to be told. After the trials are complete and the classified elements are resolved, Morrison said, the American people deserve to know how close we came to having private armies operating on U.S. soil to serve corporate interests. Overseas, David Chan secured his sniper rifle and prepared to accompany the FBI teams for debriefing. Sarah, I want you to know that watching you work these past few weeks reminded me why I became a soldier in the first place. To protect people who are trying to do the right thing. And I learned that sometimes the most important stories are the ones you never intended to tell. Sarah replied, looking at the abandoned shopping center that had become a battlefield between corporate interests and federal law enforcement. As the FBI operation concluded and the last of the mercenary trainers were taken into custody, Marcus realized that their equipment breakdown had been the most fortunate malfunction in documentary history. Without Jake's camera revealing the thermal signatures of hidden watchers, they never would have discovered the conspiracy that threatened to turn American cities into training grounds for corporate-sponsored warfare. The elusive sniper, who had been watching them throughout their assignment, turned out to be the protector they never knew they needed, and their failed wildlife documentary became the key evidence in exposing a nationwide network of illegal military contractors. 3 months later, when the trials began and the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed to the public, Sarah Chen's documentary footage would provide the visual evidence that brought down 12 major corporations and led to congressional investigations into the use of private military contractors by American businesses operating overseas. The story of urban wildlife reclaiming abandoned neighborhoods had become a story about protecting democracy from those who would use private armies to serve their financial interests. And the camera that broke down at exactly the right moment had captured evidence that changed the course of American foreign policy forever.